I.S.U.P.K presents the Lord's 51st annual Passover.
This is crazy, yo. We in the arena. Okay, I can't explain to you the level that is. This place is gonna be packed with the children of the Lord shouting in one word and one name to them all.
On Thursday, April 9th, 2020 at sundown, we're going to be holding the Lord's 51st annual Passover.
I ain't a people pleaser. I don't like people either. I don't care if your Naza Jigga ain't wanna meet you. Just give me my mother.
We're going to be located at the Westchester County Center, 198 Central Ave, White Plains, New York, 10606. $100 for all adults 17 and over. Kids are for free. Start sending in your funds today. For booking information, check us out on the I.S.U.P.K 51st Annual Passover Facebook page. More updates will be available soon. Last but not least, Israel, Commandant General Yahanna will be accepting the men willing to stand for the Hebrew Academy 2021. The Lord's 51st Annual Passover.
Well, hi everybody. Thank you and welcome to family and friends who are here, colleagues, and those of you whom I haven't had the chance to meet yet. Thank you all for coming out and support. I'm Shaniqua Walker-Barnes, and this is the book. I bring the voices of my people, a woman's vision for racial reconciliation. I thought I'd start by doing a little reading, if you don't mind, from the book, and then, and as I read, I'll also kind of tell you the story of the book and kind of why I came up with this book. There we go. All right, so this book comes from my experience of about 10 plus years floating around the heavily evangelical Christian racial reconciliation movement. And as I was doing a lot of work and going to a lot of conferences, I was often having these yes but moments, right? Well, at best I had yes but moments. At worst, I had the, what the F am I doing here moments. And so I was trying to pay attention to what was missing in the conversation on racial reconciliation. And one of the things that I noticed is that first the language on the movement is heavily dominated by male voices. And in addition to lacking women's voices, it lacks Southern Black women's voices as well. And so being a lifetime Southerner, Atlanta native, Grady baby, I thought I had something to say about race, because I think those of us in the South, we understand race in different ways than folks from other parts of the country do. And so I'll start a little bit with the story that kind of leads to the book, and a little bit of who I am and what I tried to bring to this book. I am a child of the South, a Georgia peach, born and bred in Atlanta. Not Hotlanta, mind you, the sprawling, crowded, image-obsessed city that has almost completely squeezed out its poor and working-class citizens. I grew up in the Atlanta of the 1970s and 1980s, the city where tea was always served sweet, where Black pastors preached about racial politics, where the lifelong aim of poor and working class children was to grow up to own a house in Cascade Heights, not a condo in Buckhead, where we looked to the annual June issue of Ebony magazine to see how many graduates of Douglas and Mays high schools had made it onto their list of the nation's top Black high school seniors. I grew up in the Atlanta that was viewed as the big city by other Southerners, but that seemed slow and dull to my New York friends and relatives. I grew up in the Atlanta that gave Martin Luther King Jr. his dream and Andre Benjamin his drawl. On both my maternal and paternal sides, I am the eldest of my generation, the first to be born and raised outside Jim Crow. Both of my parents had moved to Atlanta with their families when they were children. My mother's family was the first African American family to move onto Fayetteville Street in southeast Atlanta. My father's was the second to move on to South Howard a few blocks away. In my family's 5 decades in those neighborhoods, we have seen them transform from working class white to working class black to gentrifying hipster white communities that not even the most middle class of us can afford. Even as my families watched the for sale signs go up, even as my great uncle and his Vietnam vet buddies stood guard over my maternal grandfather's new home every night with high-powered rifles, moving to the city too busy to hate must have felt like newfound freedom for my grandparents. For my paternal grandfather, a South Carolina-born Gullah bricklayer. For my maternal grandfather, who had to drop out of school to take care of his younger siblings while his parents and elder siblings worked their Mississippi sharecroppers farm. For my paternal grandmother, who on more than one occasion concealed my father underneath her long skirts as she walked past hooded Klansmen in Jacksonville. For my maternal grandmother, whose own uncle had been murdered and tossed onto his parents' porch in northern Mississippi because of his involvement in the civil rights movement. But as they say, freedom is not free. As members of the first generation to benefit from the civil rights movements, my parents faced their own struggles. Being the first African American families to integrate the neighborhoods also meant that they were the first to integrate the schools. They met in 11th grade when they were among the second class of African American students who integrated all-white Gordon High School, now McNair Middle School, in 1968. Integration never happened without resistance and without trauma, and I have heard multiple stories about their traumatic experiences. Growing up with this history in this context, I found race was always part of my identity. In Atlanta, even serial killing was racialized. The Atlanta child murders began when I was 7 years old. I vividly remember the day that the school bus turned into my apartment complex and all the mothers were outside. As we disembarked, a worried-looking mother stepped up to embrace each of us and rush us inside to give us the news. Someone was killing Black children. Over the next year, each time another child's body was discovered, we would gather around the school playground at recess to share our family's conjectures. Is it the Klan? It must be the Klan. Who else would kill Black children? For Southern Black third graders, knowledge about the Klan was commonplace. Racial knowledge was commonplace. It had to be if we were going to survive. And so I go on to talk about my experiences about race in middle school and high school. I graduated from Decatur High School just down the street. Happy to see a Decatur class right here. And throughout college, learning about race, experiencing racism, always struggling with racism, and even through seminary where I began to encounter the language of racial reconciliation. And all the while I was in those spaces, again, I kept saying to myself, something is missing in this conversation. And I realized it was the voices of especially the women in my family who had taught me about race growing up at a very young age. The stories of my mother and my aunts and my grandmothers who told me the stories of what it was like to integrate a community, who told me the stories of where our family had come from. And I realized that nothing that I heard about racial reconciliation reflected those stories. It didn't integrate those stories and that wisdom. And so when I say I bring the voices of my people, I'm very much talking about my people, my family, and the wisdom that they have gave me that have enabled me to survive and transcend racism. And so I wanted to think about what does reconciliation look like that brings into play all of that and deals with all of the complexities of race. And I draw particularly on womanist theology. Womanist theology is an approach to womanist thought is an approach to activism, to scholarship that centers the experiences of Black women, right? And says we're going to start with our lived experience and go out from there. And so going on to talk about why I'm using womanist theology and how I'm using that, I say in any society, The most marginalized people best understand the rules of the system because they need to know the politics and dynamics in order to avoid being crushed by them. Women of color are often the marginalized among the marginalized. Our very survival depends on knowing how the isms work. We are constantly bending and genuflecting in order to fit into the small, contorted spaces that society has for us. We are frequently hurting from the injuries we sustain when we dare to step out of place. And we are always aware that others, men of color as well as white women and men, do not have to bend and sidestep in the same ways or to the same degree. We thus have unique vantage points from which to view how the system works. Those who are serious about liberation and reconciliation would do well to sit at our feet and learn from us. When it comes to justice and liberation, African American women are concerned not just for our own healing and liberation, we want it for everyone. We know that ain't none of us free unless all of us are. And because we are experts at wearing the mask of the strong Black woman to hide how we really feel, we know that external appearance is not a marker of internal health. Thus, womanists are concerned not just with the interpersonal, but also the intrapersonal. In other words, with the wounds that racism inflicts upon the self-image of people of color and the way in which it diminishes our capacity to see the image of God stamped upon us. At the same time, womanist theology will not allow us to limit reconciliation to the intrapersonal and interpersonal level. Feeling better about ourselves and getting along on the individual level do not make racial reconciliation. Indeed, womanists reject outright the notion that reconciliation can be reduced to interpersonal relationships because we are fully aware that power structures relationships. We refute the notion that mere intercultural contact will reduce prejudice and increase harmony. We carry the cultural memories of mothers, grandmothers, and other mothers whose service as domestic workers for white men and women provided lots of intercultural proximity during slavery and Jim Crow. We share kitchen table talk with aunts and cousins who labor today as the new domestics, home care, nursing home, and hospice nursing assistants for elderly white people, and nannies for the young. We know firsthand that such proximity does not protect us from the abuses of racism. It often renders us more susceptible. Womanists demand reconciliation that confronts inequalities in power, privilege, and access. Its telos, or its endpoint, is not simply the cessation of racial hostility. It is the establishment of justice and liberation for all women and men, regardless. In essence, womanist theology takes all that you thought you knew about racism and reconciliation and tells you that you ain't nothing but a babe wandering in the wilderness. So come on over here, child, set a spell, and let the women folk teach you something about the ways of the world. And so in the introduction, I critique the evangelical racial reconciliation movement by tying it to Promise Keepers, which, if people remember, was a predominantly white evangelical men's organization in the 1990s. Promise Keepers has diminished in its power, but it has a really lasting impact on how people talk and think about racial reconciliation, which was kind of the view that the primary problem of race is division. That's how the evangelical world thought about it, still thinks about it, is that the problem is division, and that what we need to do is to get people together, so that if black and white and people of other ethnicities get together and we just learn more about each other, then racism will disappear. And so again, coming as a woman of color from the South, whenever I heard that, I said, that's ridiculous. And sometimes I would talk to my relatives. I remember the first time I told my mom about that, and she goes, that's not the problem, right? Because again, well, black women have always been in proximity to white families, and that didn't stop racism, right? Just like being in proximity to white men doesn't stop sexism for white women, right? So proximity is not the answer, power is the problem. And so I wanted to talk about that. And so, but I also knew that part of the shortcoming in the movement was that it was not looking at anything outside of kind of the Christian scope in terms of literature on race and racism. And so I begin by, in the first chapter, which is called Racism is Not About Feelings or Friendship, providing kind of an overview of critical race theory, including Patricia Hills Collins' understanding of the matrix of domination, Eduardo Bonilla Silva's idea of the colorblind racism, and so pulling that all together, Andrea Smith's pillars of white supremacy, and talking about what racism really is. And that racism, particularly in the U.S. context, but I think globally, racism is not about how people of one race feel about another race. Racism is also not really about how people of one race treat another race. Racism is about white supremacy. And it's about the system that has been designed to promote and maintain white people's dominance in all areas of society, right? And so that we have to put that as the center point, and so that what we're trying to do then with reconciliation is to dismantle white supremacy so that we have justice for all. We have justice for all. So that's the first one in the first chapter. And then I go on to talking about how if we center the perspective of women of color, also what we'll find out is that not only is racism about maintaining white supremacy, but that racism does not affect all people in the same ways. And so that it affects people of different racial ethnic groups in different ways, but that there are some commonalities we can see if we look across our experience. And so I try to chart out the ways in which we see racism affecting that. And I also want to point out that if we center the perspectives of women of color, we get to see racism from a different vantage point than when we center the perspectives of men. There's certain elements of racism, particularly like mass incarceration, that we look at when we think about it from the perspective of men, and those are important. And there are other elements that help us to understand racism more fully when we center the perspectives of women of color. And that has to do a lot with, including with internalized racism, beauty standards and beauty politics, when we bring in sexuality, and sexual behavior and sexual stereotyping, when we talk about sexual trauma, that all of those are elements too of racism that we have to pay attention to and that help us to understand how it works. Offering instead that they be friends. Second, the relationship does not forget, deny, or minimize the past. Celie and Albert come together as new people with an old history. They do not pretend that the history does not exist. They address it openly and repeatedly. And when they do, Albert makes no demands for Celie to move on or get over it. He owns who he was and the evil for which he was responsible, just as much as he owns who he has become. Finally, and most importantly, the relationship itself is a new form. Celie's rejection of Albert's marriage proposal opens the space for them to create an entirely new relational structure, one that has no precedent in a world gripped by the powers and principalities. They defy social and religious norms about how women and men are to exist in the world and in relation to others. Their liberated and converted identities are authentic expressions of their personhood, rather than attempts to conform to or survive the racial gender status quo. Within their corner of the world, they create a microcosm of beloved community in which identities, relationships, and opportunities are not governed by racial gender hierarchies, but rather by social, political, and economic equality. They create a world that is not ruled by the powers of domination, but rather by an ethic of justice, liberation, love for self and others, authenticity, reciprocity, interdependence, and agency. In this new world, when Celie is reunited with her sister and children, she introduces Albert to them as my peoples. Liberated people in transformed relationships, creating a new world together. That is the work of building beloved community. All right. And then one last chapter is I talk about, it's called Our Spiritual Strivings. And it looks at the spiritual disciplines and practices that we need in order to sustain the work of trying to build beloved community, right? And so it's a way of trying to give a way forward, some hope in the midst of difficulty, and talking about what we have to do to be able to hang on to this work when it gets hard, as it inevitably does. And so I end by talking about it as racial reconciliation seems impossible. When you understand the full depth of the problem, it seems impossible. But for people who call themselves Christians, believing in the impossible is what we do every day. And so that's kind of the end of it. So with that, I guess we can take a couple of questions. I guess ER is back there somewhere. But we have little questions, a few time for questions, and then I'll sign. But thank you all for listening.
Okay, my name is Jeremiah. I'm with the Israelite School of Universal Practical Knowledge under Committee Yahanna. And I had a couple of questions. One of the questions, why do you think it is impossible between blacks and whites to pursue that mission and complete it fully, like you just mentioned?
Yeah, I don't know that I don't know that I think it is impossible, but I think it seems impossible, right? So when we understand the depth to which racism is the foundation of U.S. society and how all the other systems are stacked up on that, on my worst days, it seems impossible. It seems like this is never going to get fixed. This is too big. Because it's woven into our economic system, it's woven into our criminal justice system, it's woven into our educational system. So on my worst days, when I look at the depth of the problem and I don't allow myself to stay at the superficial level, that's when it seems impossible. On the other hand, I don't think that we can give in to that. And so I try to end it on a note of saying we can't give in to this feeling that it's impossible. And that even if it is impossible, it wouldn't be the first time that we've believed in an impossible thing happening, right? And so, especially if you're a person of faith, regardless of what the faith is, that's what faith is belief in the impossible and then belief in what defies logic. And so for me too, it's this seems impossible and I'm gonna believe in it anyway. So I don't think it's impossible, but I do think it's hard. I think it's much harder than we often like to give it credit for. Yeah.
Okay, I had another question.
Okay, so I'm gonna make sure other people get to ask questions. Okay. Ask the other question you really want to ask, and we'll give other people a chance, and then we'll come back to you. Okay. This time. Yeah.
Can you go now?
Yeah.
Okay. I know you talked about the reconciliation with white Americans. How do you feel about the problems that goes on amongst black people?
Yeah.
Like black people having, it seems like we should be reconciling the situations with our own race first.
Yeah. And
then maybe we can move on to something different. But how do you feel about that?
Yeah. So I talk about internalized oppression because that's a lot of what the within group dynamics have to deal with, is the way in which black people and other people of color who suffered racism, we begin to have negative views about our own racial ethnic group, right? And so I talk about that as part of the wound that has to be healed. And that's why I like using the color purple, because Celie has to do her own healing before she is reconciled with Mr., right? Her healing isn't complete necessarily, but it's underway. And so I do think there is a way in which black people, we've got a lot of healing work that we have to do within us as individuals, between us in terms of relationships, with other people of color, right? And other people of color also have the work they have to do within themselves, within their own group, and between other people of color. I don't necessarily know that it has to be sequential, like you do this healing and then you do this healing and then you do this healing. But I do think we have to be trying to do it at least simultaneously. And I do think the healing within the individual and within the group is every bit as important as the healing that goes on between blacks and whites. Yeah. Yes.
Okay, you say you grew up in the Christian church?
Yes.
Okay, my question to you is, do you believe God is for or against dismantling racism? And why?
Man, that's a complicated conversation. So I would say for dismantling racism and all forms of oppression. Now that is my particular hermeneutic of an approach to the faith. There are many Christians who will argue differently, and people argued for slavery on the basis of how they read the Bible, right? And so when I look at the Christian scriptures, actually going from the Jewish scriptures, I see the overarching story of God trying to create a people who will act like they were made in God's image. That's what I see as being the overwhelming story. And there's a whole bunch of messiness, and yes, there are parts that I ignore to make that story be the story. But I see that as being the predominant story. And so for me, that has to do with the way that we treat each other. It has to do with the way that we structure our societies. And so, yeah, I do believe that. And when I look at what God's people most often got in trouble for, it was how they treated each other. And so even in, kind of the Old Testament, there are all the stories of the kings, and they'd be like, and the king worshiped this other deity, and they did all that, but he was a good king. But the thing that always got them in trouble was oppressing the widow and the orphan and the foreigner. Like, that was when God was like, now you're going into exile because you did that. And so, yeah, so that's why I view it as the overarching story. But yeah, thank you. All right, and then we'll let this be the last question.
Yeah, I hate to ask it now because I think that question and answer.
I.S.U.P.K presents the Lord's 51st annual Passover.
Yo, this is crazy, yo. We in the arena. Okay, I can't explain to you the level that is. This place is going to be packed with the children of the Lord shouting in one word and one name to them all.
On Thursday, April 9th, 2020 at sundown, we're going to be holding the Lord's 51st annual Passover.
I ain't a people pleaser. I don't like people either. I don't care if your I.S.U.P.K ain't wanna meet you. Just give me my motherfucking.
We're going to be located at the Westchester County Center, 198 Central Ave, White Plains, New York, 10606. $100 for all adults 17 and over. Kids are for free. Start sending in your funds today. For booking information, check us out on the I.S.U.P.K 51st Annual Passover Facebook page. More updates will be available soon. Last but not least, Israel, Commandant General Yahanna will be accepting the men willing to stand for the Hebrew Academy 2021. The Lord's 51st Annual Passover.